Shalom and welcome to the One Pasuk podcast, where the rabbis at Congregation Avas Torah each share an insight on one particular pasuk from the Parsha and reflect on each other's ideas. Rabbinic banter, I like to call it. I am Chaim Pupko, and I am joined by my dear friends and teammates, Rabbi Daniel Goldberg.
Shalom.
Shalom.
We'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Doctors Naomi and Robert Spira, who are sponsoring the podcast in memory of Robert's mother, Molly Spira of blessed memory, and Naomi's father, Hyman Nutkis of blessed memory, on the anniversary of their yortzites, which occurred last week and this week. Thank you so much for the sponsorship, and may our learning and everyone's listening to this podcast be a credit for their neshamos. If you'd like to sponsor an upcoming episode, please contact the shul. All right, here we go. Before we get to our one pasuk for this week's Parsha, Parshas Vayeishev, we are very honored to have on as our guest Rabbi Menachem Genack, CEO of OU Kosher, longtime rabbi of Congregation Shomrei Emunah here in Englewood, and really the senior rabbi of the Englewood Rabbinate. He's certainly been here the longest, and he is certainly a mentor and a source of guidance and psak to myself and the other rabbis in Englewood. And so, Rabbi Genack, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Real pleasure to be here.
How long have you been in Englewood now?
It's almost 45 years.
45 years. And how did you end up in Englewood?
I've asked that question myself many times. I came to Englewood. I had just become the head of the Kashrus division. So that's a long time ago. And the one who recommended Englewood to me, there was a small shul, Shomrei Emunah, which was on Van Nosten in a house, and they were looking for a rabbi. Actually, the one who was the shadchan was Steve Katz. Many of them should know them from that's how I came.
And the rest is history.
And the rest is history. The shul was already existing when you came?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
So it was more of a minyan in a house, though. It didn't have a previous Rav.
No, it did have a previous
Oh,
Rav.
it did.
Rabbi Sosevsky?
Rabbi Sosevsky was the Rav, and the initial Rav was, but it was Rabbi Sosevsky for a long time. And then he went and, he founded, the yeshiva in Beit Meir.
Okay, our one pasuk for this week comes from Perek Lamed Zayin, Pasuk Beis, chapter 37, verse 2, second pasuk of the Parsha. Eilet Toldos Yaakov. These are the generations, or this is the line of Yaakov. Yosef ben Shva Esrei Shana Haya Roeh Esechav Batzon. Yosef was 17 years old. He was a shepherd together with his brothers. V'hu Na'ar es b'nei Bilha ve'es b'nei Zilpa Neshei Aviv. He was a helper. He was a young man together with the sons of Bilha and Zilpa. Vayaveh Yosef es dibasam ra'a el avihem. And Yosef would bring bad reports of them to their father. This pasuk introduces us into all of the controversy, the famous stories of Yosef and his brothers. Rabbi Genack, if you wouldn't mind, please, leading us off.
Well, just a few observations about this significant pasuk. Rashi quotes from the Medrash, Tol HaKosav Toldos Yaakov b'Yosef. This pasuk begins, these are the descendants, and right we were introduced to Yosef, this young Yosef, 17. And Rashi comments, Shekol Atzmo Shel Yaakov lo Ovod El Lavan El Berachel, V'Shehayo Ziv Ukinin Shel Yosef Domelo. Everything that Yaakov did till that point was to take deep love for Yosef's mother, for Rachel. He worked all those years for Lavan to marry her, and that they were like one person. And Rashi comments that they looked exactly alike. And not only physically did they look alike, but if we look at their history, Rashi comments that they had a similar history. Yaakov, Yosef, just as Yaakov was hated by his brother, by Esav, who tried to kill him, so Yosef was despised by his brothers, and they also tried to kill him. And so one thing I would also want to point out, the physical resemblance. There's an interesting medrash that says that when Yosef was tempted by Eshes Potiphar, he was on the verge of succumbing to her entreaties. She was very beautiful. He was alone in Egypt. And what appeared to him in the window was Tmus Yukno Shel Abba Nirisel B'Chalon. The image of his father Yaakov appeared to him and said, do you want to be this kind of person who's looks for harlots and so on. And that gave him the strength. That moment that his father Yaakov appeared to him, in the image of him in the window, that's what changed the course of. And so I thought what happened was that he looked in the mirror or looked in the window and he saw his own reflection. And they looked so much alike that it was Yaakov talked to him, because a big part of Yosef was that which Yaakov was embedded in him, not only physically, but in terms of they were one person. Pasuk will say later on, as relates to Benafsho, Kshuva Benafsho. They were just tied together in every respect. And that's what saved him. He could have veered off in the wrong direction. It was that close identity. And they had identical histories, both hated by their brothers, both created the Knesset Yisrael. And so, you never know where history is going to veer off. It's the next pasuk later tells us that Yaakov gave Yosef Exonis Pasim. So Pasim can be interpreted in many ways. The Ramban talks about it, but we always assume it to be a multicolored garment. Others say it's not. The Ramban doesn't think it was multicolored. It was one, maybe stripes or something. But the Ramban says it was the clothing of royalty in those days. So of course that also generated more hatred from his brothers. But because Yosef was destined to be a leader, and that his leadership skills are the most extraordinary in Egypt, ultimately to de facto rule over this empire at the time, saved the Jewish people for that time. And so we see Yaakov obviously saw within his son Yosef those extraordinary ability. And the Xonas Pasim represents that to a degree.
When you mentioned the Demus Diukno, it reminded me of when Rav Aaron Soloveitchik passed away, right? It was Chol Moed Sukkos, and his son-in-law was giving a hesped. So his son-in-law talked about the Demus Diukno, that, if I remember correctly, I think he was talking about, Rav Moshe, and how Rav Aaron was so deeply committed to the heritage, the legacy that he inherited, that it's the image of his father, or the image of Reb Chaim that really. And it's interesting because I was thinking about the fact that the Rav also talked about how there's that famous thing that the Rav wrote about how when he's learning, he sees the Rambam coming in, his grandfather, Reb Chaim Brisker. You don't necessarily think of the Soloveitchiks as romantics, but you see there's this deep sense of connection to the Demus Diukno, the image and the heritage, the legacy that they had.
Well, absolutely. The Rav is the only grandchild of Reb Chaim who actually knew Reb Chaim. The Rav was, I think, 16 or 17 when he died. Reb Chaim died. And Reb Chaim was, saw in his grandson, his extraordinary intellectual gifts and, spiritual gifts. And when he was a little boy, he wrote a kuntrus, which was published later, Kuntrus Chaslavich. He must have been barely bar mitzvah when he wrote it. And Reb Moshe brought it to Reb Chaim to show it to him. It's printed in the Chedusha grid. And Reb Chaim wasn't well at the time, but when he read it, he jumped out of bed and he ran to show it to the Dayan of Bris, the Simcha Zelik. So the Rav would often speak about, usually he would say, I heard from my father the name of my grandfather. But there's certain things he said that he heard directly from, but the one thing he said, coming back to what Rabbi Bukru said, he said the experience that he has of Yom Kippur and why Yom Kippur is so impactful for him is he remembers standing next to his grandfather, Reb Chaim, Yom Kippur. Chaim saying the Avoda, he said, with a very deep, resonant voice. And that always inspired him. And actually, the Avoda Sayom was always one of the topics that the Rav used to study with us and learn with us often before Yom Kippur. You mentioned that Rabban Soloveitchik's Levi was on Sukkot. I remember going to the Levi, it was in Chicago. But I'll tell you, but in order for me to get there, I had to leave very, very, very early in the morning. And so I got to it was an extraordinary experience. I took my Luvelet Esrog with me. And as I'm going through security, the guard there says, do you mind if I make a bracha on your lulav and esrog?
Wow.
You never know. So the sad thing is, I told her, you can't really make a bracha yet because it was before Amud HaShachar even. It was too early. So I explained that to him.
He asked the wrong person.
He asked halachic, man.
But I told you, but you can shake it still, and so on. She did. But
wonder what the Chabad answer would have been.
Right.
That's last week.
Yeah.
That's amazing. What a story.
I read in the Reb's writing that Rav Chaim also, he memorized all of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur because he liked to daven
That's
Baal Peh.
correct. The Rebbe said that Rav Chaim used to he memorized the whole tefillah, the avoda, and he before.
Could you imagine such a thing, to memorize the entire avoda?
He would have somebody test him before, because he said if he would read from a machzor, a siddur, it wasn't the same kavanas. He wanted to say it by heart.
Wow.
That's astonishing.
Wow.
I'll highlight the word that you picked out in the pasuk, the word na'ar, and something that Rabbi Genack said also ties back into it. It's an interesting word. Rashi picks up on it. And Rashi suggests that there was a childlike activity taking place in Yosef's life. He was very concerned with the way he appeared. He was misalsel b'sa'aro, constantly taking care of the way he looked. And really, when we think about the personality that Yosef is and the spiritual giant that he is, it seems rather out of character that he would be so caught up with his physical appearance. I saw in Rav Schwab's Sefer, he brings that the word Na'ar appears actually in last week's parasha as well. And there it's referring to Shechem. And we know, after all, Shechem was no Nar. He was an older, established, well-respected individual. Why does the pasuk call him a Nar? And the Mefarshim explain is because he was impulsive in his agreement to Shimon and Levi's demands. Shimon and Levi demanded that they all get Brit Milah, and right away, Shechem says, we'll do it. And so that impetuousness, that impulsive reaction, earns him the title Nar. And here, when the pasuk refers to Yosef as Nar, and Rashi picks up that he's somebody who cares very much about his appearance, it's by no means a vain attempt to look very good as a teenager, but rather, Yosef understood from his dreams that he was going to be the king. And Yosef understood that he has a responsibility as such to carry himself accordingly. And what his brothers found so frustrating was that as a young 17-year-old, he was already acting like a melech. Now, later in life, of course, it would be incumbent upon him to carry himself a certain way, to appear a certain way, but it was his attitude of nar, of jumping the gun, of acting like somebody was already a king that got him in trouble. As Rabbi Genack alluded to earlier, the Ketonet Pasim was also, it was a garment of royalty. And those types of activities is what caused his brothers to turn against him. But Yosef, being careful about the way he appeared, was not because he was vain, but rather it was his adherence to halacha and the requirement that a king has to carry himself and appear a certain way that motivated him to be somebody who was into his appearance, not merely because the nar, the childish nature of who he was, is what caused it to come about.
That ties in with something I've always felt about this whole story with Yosef and his dreams, and why he conducted himself the way he did, and why Yaakov shamar es hadavar, Yaakov didn't really take action. I've always felt that Yosef knew he had a special destiny, but he didn't know what it was yet. And Yaakov didn't know what it was yet. And as it unfolded, he then learns and then realizes and grows into the person that he ultimately becomes. But he's someone whose character really develops before our eyes, because at this very early stage, the things that look so bizarre, I think, are a reflection of the fact that he knew there was something special in store for him, but he just couldn't figure it out yet.
Rav Soloveitchik used to say, I think it has this written also, he had two dreams that were in a sense mutually exclusive. One dream is Malim Lumit. He saw within the field that the sheaves are bowing down essentially to him, right, to what's one. And then he had another dream that the sun and the moon and the stars are bowing to him. And so they're two different kinds of dreams. One represents power, economic power, the sheaves, political power, that he was destined to be, as you said, to be the king. But the other was spiritual power. And those two often are mutually exclusive. And somehow, coming back to what he was destined for both. And he was ultimately able to integrate both of these, because the spiritual dimension requires humility, and the political, economic requires power, strength, mutually exclusive to humility, and also recognition of Kadosh Baruch Hu's hand in all of this. He was able to ultimately to integrate these two dreams in one destiny.
It's very beautiful. You know, in a certain way, you're all kind of weighing in on, like, the central question of this pasuk, to my mind, is how is the Torah characterizing Yosef, right? It gives us such a complex early kind of introduction to Yosef. It's not that Yosef, we're introduced to him as the Ish Tzaddik. We're introduced to him as in a younger stage. The question is, every dimension of this pasuk, you'll find really a gamut of Mefarshim reflecting more positively on Yosef, or maybe a little bit more of a earlier in his stage of development, a little less positively. I mean, the Pashup shot of the Rashi that he was involved in Maases, Nairus, is that he was there was a sense of immaturity, let's say here, a little bit of vanity, bringing dibasam ra'a to their father, again, on a Pashup level, does not necessarily reflect very well on Yosef. Ro'eh es echav batzon, this strange formulation, it can be that he was the supervisor because he was naturally endowed with leadership qualities, or it could be that he was apprenticing. He wasn't being ro'eh es atzon, he was ro'eh es echav batzon because he was more junior to them, so he was learning the ways. When he's with Bnei Bilhah, Bnei Zilpah, you can read that as him being extraordinarily gracious, even to the members of the family that had the lowest status. Right, that's one reading here that Rashi presents us with. Other of the Mefarshim say if Yosef was extending such an olive branch to these brothers, where were they? The Ramban says, why didn't they defend Yosef when the brothers sell Yosef? So maybe, right, there's so much complexity in this pasuk. It's definitely presenting us with a very nuanced picture of Yosef, not wholly perfect and not totally negative. But there's room for dynamism for him to grow, right? We see Yosef grow into Yosef through the travails and the tribulations that he goes through. So I don't think it should be shocking to anyone to say that our first introduction to Yosef is a complexer, more of a complex vision and image of Yosef. But every single clause in this pasuk is it's open for interpretation. It's such an inviting pasuk, and it's almost like a Rorschach test. It's like, well, do you want to read this positively, or do you want to read this a little bit more negatively? Again, with the understanding that he's a dynamic character who's going to grow into Yosef HaTzadik, and you have to start somewhere and grow to something. So, I think it was entirely predictable that Rabbi Kisus would take the biggest limud schos, because this reflects a little bit of a deeper discussion that maybe we'll get to. It's been sub rosa in a lot of our discussions of like Rabbi Kisus's default assumption and a certain mahalach, which sees.
I have that same assumption about you and your life.
I appreciate it. I'm sorry for bringing that into question by speaking in this. So I don't mean to shake that image of you, that you have of me. But in any event, it touches on that in a very deep way. I'll highlight one, I think, very profound, very sympathetic reading of this pasuk,
but not negative.
Not negative. No, this is a sympathetic reading. Actually, it's neither really morally positive or negative. It's more neutral from Rav Hirsch, and he just notes that we know that Yosef at this point does not have his mother. Rachel has already passed away. Binyamin is very, very young, so he's not really a companion to Yosef. He's not really in this picture. And Rav Hirsch notes that it says, Hayaro'eh es echav batzon. He was with his brothers, the Bnei Leah, when they're in the field. He had like a professional relationship with them. Mm. And then, V'hu he was like a young man, like he hung out with his peers, let's say, were Bnei Bilhah ves Bnei Zilpah, Nishei Aviv, the wives of his father. Which is to say, it doesn't describe them as brothers really, but like the children of the wives of his father. So, as Rav Hirsch says, in the translation at least, it says motherless and brotherless. Mm. He had a motherless and brotherless youth. And so it paints this very, very sympathetic picture of Yosef kind of alone. And I think that as a starting point for trying to understand where Yosef is in this story, his psyche, his emotional world, is a very powerful kind of starting place to think about how the whole narrative develops from here.
And it sets the stage for later in his life when he is sold away. He's on his own.
Yes.
He is estranged from his brothers. They don't recognize him. And even as he's estranged from his brothers, the Torah notes very clearly that he doesn't sit with the Egyptians either.
Yeah.
Yosef is forced to be in solitude throughout his life. And his great achievement is he still finds his place despite that.
Yeah. And I think that probably one of the most dramatic and tragic psukim in the Torah is after Yaakov passes away and the brothers, they come to Yosef, they throw themselves at his feet, and they say what the Gemara in Brachos says was not true, was a case of being Mishanim Pnei HaShalom, when they say, our father told us before, he died that you shouldn't take revenge on us. And And Yosef begins to cry because he realizes that as much as he thought he had mended the relationship,
they were still afraid.
They were still afraid. There was still something he's still alone. There's still a gap. And so Yosef, just that vision of Yosef as like eternally alone is a
That's
very
how some also interpret
vision.
the Et Achai Anochi Mevakesh. When he was blundering in the field, it wasn't so much that he was looking physically for his brothers.
Right. He's looking for brotherhood.
That brotherhood.
Wow, that's such a beautiful reading.
I wanted to focus on something different that is often observed about this pasuk, and which is it's a little incongruous from the beginning to the end, because it says, Eile Toldos Yaakov. These are the Toldos, the generations, but then it focuses strictly on Yosef. Doesn't really give you the broad Toldos, at least immediately. And Chazal note this. Rashi actually cites it in the previous pasuk and says that really this Eile Toldos Yaakov has to be understood in context. It's coming after Ve'ele Toldos Esav, right? That we're given all the generations of Esav. And Chazal go even further, because they say that Yaakov looks at the generations of Esav, and what does he see? He sees mighty kings, alufim, clans. It looks relatively orderly and strong and competent. And here, the beginnings of our generations are so mired in controversy and conflict and infighting. And looking at that contrast, it's a little discouraging. And so the Eile Toldos Yaakov, Yosef, is meant to set up that contrast, to acknowledge that there's a lot of hurdles in the path of the children of Yaakov, Bnei Yisrael, achieving their greatness. And it will take time and it'll take suffering, but we'll get there. And Rashi, or Chazal, I should say, the Medrash quotes the pasuk that says that, Yaakov is like fire and Yosef is a flame and Esav is straw. And I was thinking about this in the context of our world today. And I realized that growing up, I'm a young person, growing up, I rarely felt vulnerable as a Jew, especially growing up in America. And I grew up at a time when Israel was a given and Sahal, the IDF, is strong. And though there were many terrible terrorist attacks, I don't think I ever thought about anything as like an existential threat growing up. But this war has introduced into our generation a certain sense of vulnerability, or at least some members of our generation, a certain sense of vulnerability that we've never felt before. Certainly after October 7th, but for me, even more so with the threat of Hezbollah, because they were saying that the Iron Dome, David's sling, really couldn't defend against much of their arsenal, and that this is a real threat. And then just thinking about this medrash that Yaakov is a fire and Yosef is a flame and the house of Esav is straw, it really bolstered my emunah, I can say plainly. It really bolstered my emunah and my recognition that these feelings of vulnerability, at the end of the day, seeing how our brothers and sisters have been dealing with our enemies and neutralizing certain threats, and revealing certain enemies of ours to be paper tigers, to be straw, to be mamash straw, it's really amazing. The feeling, the recognition that Hashem is supporting us, that though there are times when we'll feel vulnerable, we should always maintain faith. This medrash, by paralleling what's going on right now, it really reinforces those ideas in a very intense way.
In last week's Parsha, we read about Yaakov's dream angels, Olam v'Yordim. I'll just tell you a word that I once heard at Rav Henkin's Levaya. I found it very moving. I think it might have been Rav Bick who said this, but he said,
which Rav Henkin? Rav Eliyahu Henkin?
Yeah, he was one of the Gedolim, really a great man. And so Rav Bick, when he was maspiding, he said, the question, the Rashi comments, is Olam v'Yordim. After all, the abode of the angels is in the heavens. So why is it should be Yordim? They're coming down, not going up. So Rashi comments that these these are just different sets of angels. One set of angel is the angels of Eretz Yisrael, of Israel, that were always accompanying Yaakov. And as he was leaving, about to leave to go, running away from his murderous brother to fall into the hands of his treacherous father-in-law Lavan, a new set of angels of Chutzlars come. So he said, there's a question that everybody asks. We say every Shabbos, Shalom Aleichem. So it seems very, very strange. We invite the angels in, Malach Shabbos, and within a minute we, tell them to leave. Say Shalom, please leave, right? So how is that? So they said, I think it might be the quote of the Hank, and he said, with this one, he says, no, these are not the same angels. The angels that we say Shalom Aleichem to are the angels of Shabbos. And then we bid farewell to the angels of Chol, who are about to leave, the changing of the guard.
All right, Rabbi Genack, thank you so much for being here with us. We really appreciate it. Thank you all so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed. If you're interested in sponsoring a future episode, please reach out to one of us. And of course, please send us your feedback. Shabbat Shalom and Good Shabbos from the One Pasuk Podcast.
Hashem, Hashem.